Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's SAGA session. My name is Tobias, and I'm the host for this evening. And SAGA is the Swedish Annual Game Design Awards, and we hold these SAGA sessions twice each month to spread knowledge about board game design and design-related topics. We do this in collaboration with Studiefrämjandet Stockholm and the Discord channel Speldesign Bubble. And for each of these sessions, we have invited a special guest who will do a presentation about a topic of their choice. And for tonight, we have invited Allan Kirkeby to talk about the overlap and differences when designing for screen and tabletop games. I don't think I will say anything more than that. Just one quick thing. And if you have any questions for Allan, you can write them in the chat, and I will monitor the chat throughout the presentation. And afterwards, we will have a Q&A session as usual, and we will address all of the questions then. So, without further ado, I will let you take over, Allan, and welcome and thank you for doing this.
Yes, thank you. Do you have my sound going through? Yeah. Let me see this sharing thing, if it now works. Sign the screen. Let's try this. Do you see a full screen slide? I think you do.
Yes, we do.
Okay. So as mentioned, you can write any questions along the way in the chat, but I won't be able to see it. So if you have like a pressing question, you need to speak up because I can only see my slideshow right now. So I'm just gonna go ahead with this. Yeah, I was asked to talk a little bit about this digital and tabletop design and what were the differences. So I put together these slides. We're kind of going through the top view of it. So maybe if you have like more detailed questions, want to ask about specific mechanics or something you're working with, that's you should do that in the questions. Okay, so before I start talking about the topic, I can just talk about myself. I started in the computer games industry in 1994. I was just a high school student that did some computer music, and then it kind of evolved into me being an executive producer and along the way also game designer. And I've got credits listed in 80 plus games and interactive productions that have been published. Many years ago now, some of them. I've also done tabletop, and I'm assuming most of the people in this session are interested in tabletop. I'm not sure we picked up any computer game developers, but I'm curious to hear if you are. So I'm going to angle it towards tabletop designers. I have these two games out. Well, Revenant is not out yet; it's on its way. And today I work as a biz dev. My title is senior business developer, but I primarily work as a mentor and coach for teams that want to start developing their own games and finding and helping them to learn how to pitch to publishers and also how to design a good game for the market and so on. So actually what I'm talking about today is also overlaps a lot with my day job, you could say. And a little bit more about a couple of examples of stuff I've done. The first, just very quickly, it's just images, right, of the boxes. But the first one is Commodore Amiga. So way back, the very first thing I was involved with, I just made some music for that one. And then the Garfield and the Apache helicopter and the Serious Sam ones were stuff where I was like the producer and the game director and so on. Then I switched to Unity, which is a computer game technology. I was joined them very early on, and I ended up being CEO of a studio there. And we worked on a Fusion Fall MMO with Cartoon Networks, and we also launched the mobile game. It's like a runner called Spaceheads. And then the rightmost images are images of us doing installations. The top image is from the Volkswagen's headquarters, where we did interactive installations with data visualizations and all that stuff. So a lot of digital experience as well. Okay, so why is it interesting to compare and talk about the overlap between digital and tabletop? For me, it's interesting because it's my life, right? I've been doing this. I've been playing games, board games as well, playing Magic cards and various board games throughout my life, and I've been also designing them my entire life. But my job has been with digital games, so I am obviously seeing a lot of overlap, and I also see places where there's no overlap. But I guess what I've discovered in my career is that it's not that, yeah, it's common that people that make computer games also play board games or the other way around. But it's not that often that someone who has created a board game has also created a digital game. And I see that as, so that means there's an opportunity to discover synergies. You know, they are similar in the sense that they both aim to kind of create fun games, engage players with this experience we're creating for them. And they all share systems like rules, and you want to talk about pacing and how the game flows and interaction and so on. So that is a great overlap. And they all have constraints that we need to consider, and maybe this is where the biggest difference is in terms of what you need to know as a designer. But what we are also seeing is a lot of the cross-pollination between these different mediums is where some of the newer innovation is happening, right? I mean, we just saw this poker game being a hit, right? Bellatro. That's basically poker, but someone just did a variation on it and did it as a computer game. Could that have been done as a variation of poker as a physical game? I don't think so, because the amount of variation in there is difficult to replicate in physical formats. But it works because they've learned from a board game and the other way around. So there's lots of examples there. Oh, I forgot my agenda slide. So you're just going to have to hang on and take it in strides. So what are there are some shared creative challenges. I just talked about some of the overlap. But what makes a game engaging? And that is common across both of the mediums. I mean, theme and narrative, where theme obviously is very recognizable for board game designers and for computer game designers. Is it zombies, or is it robots, or is it you know, we all know this thing. Narrative is probably more you know, more evident in computer games, because you can have a passive viewer experience in combination with spurts of gameplay in most typical modern computer games, where narrative is less common across the medium of board games and tabletop games. You know, there are games like Gloomhaven where you play a narrative, but most of the gameplay is actually moving board pieces around. So that's not the same thing. But they both matter. If not, then the emergent narrative that players tell about what they experienced when playing with each other. Of course, there's mechanics, rule sets. I'm going to float a little bit over that because you all know what that is. Was that a comment? Question? No? Okay. I just heard something. And then a player agency is relevant in both games. Player agency is basically how much can you influence the game? What can you do? And what are the interesting actions? And do you actually feel they are interesting? And do you have control of what you do in the game? That is super relevant for both areas. Then we have something called feedback loops. And when I wrote this, I was just discovering that I've never used that term when I've talked about board games. I use it very often when we talk about computer games. And obviously that's because a computer game loop is very fast-paced. And it's very much about both acting as a player, but also reacting on a second-by-second level. And that's how computer games are played, most games anyway. In board games, they are more turn-based. So maybe this is a place where board game designers actually work with this, but they don't call it this turn. They're not aware of it. It's basically whenever a player does an action, and then what you would call the game responds to the player. In a sense that the action is to buy a card from an open display shop. You buy the card, you take the card, the shop is updated with a new card coming out, and suddenly there is a new choice you can take. Then you can go back and repeat that and buy a new card if you want, depending on how the game is designed. And that is basically a feedback loop. It's input resulting in a change in the state of the game that gives you new information. So you get some feedback based on your action. And, that's very obvious in computer games because you move your character, your position is changed, you're closer to the monsters, and it happens very fast. But I think that is a relevant way of also thinking about board games. And then, of course, flow and pacing. In a board game, we talk about wait times between turns. But we also have to think, when we think about it, it's also about what do you do on your turn. Is it fun? Does a game feel slow? Does it feel fast? And along the journey of a gameplay session, does it bog down over time? Does it become slower? Like the end turn suddenly take a long time. And all of that is important for a game designer. And it's also important for a digital game designer. So diverging paths, where are they different? Where are the two areas different? And I cannot cover everything, but these are just the key points, I think. So most importantly, first of all, we all design, as I mentioned in the beginning, we want to create these good player experiences, these good gameplay experiences for players to join into, but we have to remember that players have different expectations or different, and expectations are shaped by what they have experienced while playing these games before. And then that enforces that expectation. So for example, in a digital game, we start from the bottom, you mostly play alone. And if a player has a good experience and it releases endorphins because they kill some monsters or they get some loot during a game or they score some points, then that becomes associated with sitting in your room alone and playing, and then becomes the association with playing a computer game. It's a lonely activity. I know there are multiplayer games, I know there's online stuff going on, but if you look at them, most people play either on their phone or on the PC, on their console, mostly alone. And it's different for tabletop games. For tabletop players, a big part of playing is to get together with others. And I would argue that for some players, that is more important than the game itself. And very often, that is a thing you need to think about when there's differences. And I think these two behaviors kind of start blending a little bit, also because there's more and more cross-pollinated games that do different things. But it's an interesting thing to think about. And maybe there's also an opportunity to learn something from maybe there might be computer players who want to look at the faces of others when they play. Or maybe there's an opening. There is a lot more solo games going on. So yeah, but to go from the top, digital games, players want what's called immersion. And that is basically they want to suspend disbelief and they want to dive into a fantasy realm and become one with it. That's maybe a little bit much if you're just playing Candy Crush on your phone, but if you play an Assassin's Creed game, that's what you want to be. You want to be that assassin and you run around in this world and feel like you're one with the game. You also have the audiovisual game development part of it, which basically means it's kind of all around you, right? You have a headset on, and then they expect I've called it responsiveness, but it's action based, right? They want the game to react to their input right away, and if it doesn't, it's a boring game. Now, of course, that's generally speaking about most people that play games. I mean, of course, you can play turn-based games and play board games on your computer, but for most computer gamers, it's about the action, and the action might be slow, but even slow-paced games. I mean, a game like Vampire Survivors, if you played that, it's fairly slow in the beginning, but it's still much, much faster than how the game moves and the communication moves in the tabletop game. If you look at tabletop players, they want the social activity. Many also go for if you choose to play tabletop versus digital, they enjoy the fact that they can move pieces around. And a big part of many games, like tile laying games, is to place the pieces in certain orders and stack them on top of each other. And that is something that it's also difficult to replicate in a computer game. And then there's the face-to-face negotiation, which is almost impossible on the digital platform unless you use the camera, and you rarely do that in computer games. So when we design, we should always, as designers, remember that we design for players who have expectations of what kind of thing they will experience. And when we keep that in mind, it can also become a barrier. If you want to try and get a computer gamer to play a tabletop game, that will be a different experience than what they would like to have because they play computer games. So there are also differences in the interaction, way you interact. And I see it a little bit like how the game is activated. When does it become a game? And for a digital game, you have a system and some automation that presents you with options to interact with. And I call this the digital gamer reacts to the game world and plays within it. Where with the tabletop game, the players, we design the rules, we design a board. Nothing happens if the player doesn't do anything. And the players need to negotiate. I know there are rules, so it's not like a group of 4 players around a table. They would not necessarily say that they negotiate what happens, but it's a little bit like a role-playing game where, the most obvious example is if a rule is unclear, the players around the table then go like, well, it seems most fair if we do it like that. And that's obviously if something is unclear, but even if something is clear, everyone needs to kind of follow those rules. Not because there's a computer system that forces them to do so, but because we have agreed to do it, right? So I would say the tabletop gamer makes the game play by enacting the instructions from a pre-learned rule set. And I think that is a core difference that for the people that in the different mediums that don't play the other medium is the primary reason why they would not play the other medium. So tabletop gamers who do not enjoy computer games probably don't enjoy it because they can't talk to other players or the other way around. Okay. So the variation of games and the diversity across the mediums is also instructed or or shaped by the systems that are most predominant and the mechanics that are most predominant, and the way these systems work. So certain genres work better in one place or the other. So for digital, I mean, this is pretty obvious. So that's why I call this talk a little bit high level. But you have real-time action in a digital game. You have persistent worlds, which means, and you have a massive scale. So a massive scale might not seem massive if you play Subway Surfers, or might not seem like it's massive if you play Candy Crush. But there's a huge amount of game components if you had to create them as physical components. But it's much more obvious that it's a massive world if you play a big Assassin's Creed game, or the old World of Warcraft is obviously a massive world. It's also persistent worlds that may change even if you go away from the game. So you can have a feeling of the game existing even though you're not playing. Where a tabletop game is basically, when it's packed into the box, it's gone. So that's a big difference. With tabletop, you have turn-based interaction, and that plays a lot into the social nuance of a game, which is eye contact and bluffing, for example. And then I also have something I call physical creativity, which is it allows, because the rules are enforced by the players, it also allows the players the freedom, because there's no outside force, there's no computer rule set that arbitrates and forces you to do certain things. And most players have tried this. Most game groups have tried house rules. And that is basically what I call physical creativity. There's also tactility. There's the simple thing of just choosing how you align your user interface. I know you have your player board and you can't rip it apart, but you can choose to place your card tableau on the left side or the right side. And for a lot of people who play games, those are small, creative activities they do while they play the game. I mean, when I play Terraforming Mars, big part of it is it's not a big part of it, but it's a part of it that things need to be positioned around the table. So yeah, it's kind of strange, small things, but it's all things that make them different. And obviously, the type of genres that lend themselves better to real-time or persistent world or massive scale work better as digital games. It's difficult if you have a real-time action first-person shooter to translate that into a board game. And it is maybe easier to translate the other way around, but it's difficult to do it in a way where you would satisfy computer game players. Because if you're just making a board game, why would you not just play a board game? Okay, so we all know the term mechanics, I assume. So that's different game systems and elements that make the game play. Some of them overlap with components. And computer games have the same thing. We don't call them components, but they are assets. Assets and components, roughly the same thing. So I have a few things that translate well and some that don't. So just a very simple overview of systems and mechanics that are very often seen in both mediums is these. You have resource management. That is basically collecting, gathering, saving up, spending, and converting resources. Wood, metal, food. We all know these games. It's StarCraft or Warcraft or real-time strategy games on the computer, and it's all kinds of Uwe Rosenberg or other games in board games, right? Area control is also very traditional, all the way back from chess, right? Or maybe we don't call it area control, but you take control and dominate certain parts by threatening with your board pieces, right? That is also StarCraft. That is also computer games. in so many ways, even slightly overlapping with Fortnite or something like that, where you kind of take parts of the map and use them to your advantage. Of course, drafting and set collection is very well known for board gamers. It's one of those mechanics that are so prevalent and normal in board games that we almost associate it with it. But you also do it if you play a Diablo game and you want to collect a certain armor set. That's set collection. But we don't necessarily. It's a set, right? It's an armor set. So yes, it's set collection. But we normally don't see it as the same mechanism. But what maybe is more comparable is these new roguelikes, where after every second wave or attack wave or amount of experience points, you get a choice of upgrade options in your computer game. That's actually like drawing 3 cards and choosing one to keep for your hand, or drawing 3 cards and choosing one to put into your deck in a deck building game. So a lot of these things have existed in both areas for a long time. Of course, cooperative play structures is happening as well and have existed in both. I mean, in the old days on the computer, it was like local cooperative play structures. I mean, competitive is also area control, but cooperative is we talk about co-op games as a unique thing, but even in non-co-op games, there is this social negotiation on the board game side where people would still talk about, are you going to buy that one? Are you going to buy the upgrade to give +1 to harvesting wood or whatever? That happens around the board game table, even in a competitive game, and that is kind of the similar to these kind of overlaps with what I called cooperative or negotiated play structures, basically. In computer games, it requires either the game to be designed more specifically for it, because as I said, the default is a solo game experience. So it's something that the game designer and the development team on a digital platform needs to think about more specifically how to achieve both PvP gameplay, like multiplayer gameplay, and cooperative gameplay. And then, of course, incentives and point systems. So that is, I don't want to explain more about that. That is pretty much self-evident, I think. If not, ask me a question later. So mechanics that don't translate. And these are not like they are totally impossible to translate. It's just that every time someone attempts this, you need to think and design extremely carefully around them, right? And obviously, real-time mechanics, like action mechanics, they do exist in board games, but they are very easy in digital games because the computer game keeps ticking, the clock keeps ticking, things keep updating on the screen, enemies keep moving, and the player will get to react to them without having to himself or herself perform any actions to make them move. And that's why it becomes a little bit clunky that in a board game, the players are also acting out the board game systems depending on how it's designed. And most real-time games that are board games need to be very simple, otherwise it just becomes clunky. Social cues are very easy to include as part of your game design for a tabletop game. I mean, if it's a bluffing game, or if you're playing, now I can't remember what it's called, the card game with 12 cards and you have to kill the queen or something. Love letter, yeah. It's a huge part of the gameplay that you can see the other players, you can talk to them, you can try and bluff them, you can You can charm them, you can do different things. So that is something that designers put in there, and it's very complicated to put into a digital game. I think there have been a few examples of these games that have been successful, that have worked, where people log into a lobby and they have their audio on and they can talk. But it is very complicated to make it happen, especially if you go deeper into the social interactions beyond just text or voice words. You go into eye contact or body language, that's almost impossible. And then one thing that is maybe one of the things that people try and translate often, and we see more and more complicated tabletop games trying to add more and more complex systems in there, but it's really difficult. And that's obviously when you have like physics systems that physics overlap with real time. You could also just have complicated math. It's not like rocket science math, but or very huge systems or database grids or something like that. That obviously works very easily on digital formats. And it's one of the things that a lot of digital games use to create replayability. It's probably also very comparable to what Magic the Gathering has in terms of this. Is why Magic is called one of the most complicated games in the world, mostly because of the amount of cards. I mean, one person owns all the cards, I think. I mean, maybe there are a few people that own a lot, but I mean, I have like thousands of different Magic cards, and I just have a fraction of what exists, right? But in a digital game, you can give that entire experience to the player, and you can make it accessible, and you can make it easy to navigate, and that is almost impossible on tabletop. And I would argue that as a designer, you should try and avoid it. It's kind of traps if you try that on the wrong medium, and all of these are. Okay, so that was kind of high flight over the design mechanics things. I want to talk a little bit about other things that influence how we design and why we need to design in certain ways, and that's the design journey, what progress we go through, what steps, and then also some of the production situations that affect how we need to adjust our designs. So first of all, this is, if you don't know, this might be interesting. If you know, it's not, but it's basically, there's a big difference between the job of a tabletop designer and the involvement with the game compared to a digital game designer. And so a tabletop designer, and this is based on my own experience and talking to a lot of other designers, and there are variants and people differ all over the spectrum, right? So, but this is very a general view. The design and prototype work is low cost for a tabletop designer. I personally work solo. Most of the people I work with work solo or in pairs as two designers. They print their own prototype components. They don't use fancy graphics because that's not relevant, and that's because they pitch and sell the game design. You do not. So this is for a designer who wants to get published. To get published, you usually have to go through a publisher. It's very difficult actually to self-publish a board game, but you can do. And if you do, then you need to go through the production process, which I will talk about in a minute. That means, and this actually shapes the way a designer works, because you are designing towards achieving the next goal in your path to be published. And the next goal is signing with a publisher and then handing over to the publisher. And most of the time, the production and the costs associated with the production and the hiring of graphic artists and a factory somewhere, typically in the East, that produces the game, and all of that stuff is handled by the publisher. That is different in digital. So the design is, the process, the design is integrated with the production. Prototyping, creating a prototype often requires multiple people with different skill sets. unless you're a multi-talent. But usually you need a graphic artist, you need a programmer, and then you need a designer. And if that's one person who does all that, that's fine. But very often it's multiple. And then why do you need that? Because why couldn't you just write a paper and write a concept and pitch it? But that's because what you're selling when you're pitching is the full product vision. And it is technically the full product. But because you now have multiple people working on it, it's impossible for everyone to work without a salary during this period. And when you get more people together, it's very rare that all of them are willing to work for free. So you need some kind of income. And that's why you need to try and sell it before the game is actually finished, and even before the game design is totally finished. So what you're selling is the full product vision, and trying to get a publisher and an investor to invest in that. And they do not invest initially in the game they see. Well, they do technically, but they also evaluate the team's ability to complete this game to a stage that will become a hit. And that is different from how a publisher, board games publisher, evaluate the game. They evaluate the game based on the prototype, and if it's fun there, that's the game. They buy that. There's very little risk in terms of that. And of course, digital production is then extremely high. And I would probably argue that board game production is also quite costly. But because I'm a board game designer, I'm not sitting with those spreadsheets. That's what the publishers do, and there's a split there. But if, as a designer on a digital game, you're part of a team, and you need to be helping that team with making sure you can hit the budgets and the timelines as well, because it's very costly. So if you need 100 board pieces, you are handcrafting each of those 100 board pieces into the production quality that the end consumer will see in a digital game. In a board game, you just buy some random cubes and pitch it to the publisher, and then it's up to the publisher to make sure what kind of pieces they produce and so on. Okay. So what other challenges are there and how is that relevant for the designer when we go into production? But digital production, the most relevant thing is that the designer is working and involved through all of the production. We call it game development. And the term game development sometimes is used to cover, game programming, but it's, in my mind, it's everything. It's the graphics work. It's the design work. It's the early design work. I know you differentiate between the prototyping phase and the development phase, but overall, it's the same people working from the first idea up to the finished game. And they just add more people to make sure they can build this entire volume of components and elements that need to go into the game. So there's very long timelines, and the designer is working on this one game. So a digital designer is rarely working on multiple games, especially if it's big games. Smaller games, they can. Most of the time, it's one designer on one game, sometimes up to 3 years or even more. And not looking, and it's not like sitting there and waiting for the testers, but it's actually hands-on tweaking, testing all the systems, all the situations in the game. And you could argue that if you joined the development stage with your board game publisher, it's kind of the same work you do, but not all board game designers do that. So production challenges for digital games also involve technical complexity of programming and bugs and being able to run on multiple different computer platforms. That is not a designer's challenge as such. It's the programmers that need to solve it, but the designer needs to have enough technical knowledge to be able to communicate with the programmers and design optimal systems that leverage what resources we have and also avoids taxing those resources too much in terms of processing power and so on. Of course, there's team specialization. You need to be able to work with graphic artists. You need to be able to communicate with them how the user interface should look, how it's optimal, so they communicate your game design the best possible way. And then there's a huge volume of work. If you're making a game that's supposed to have a single player play for 40 or 100 hours in the same world, you need to create hundreds and thousands of small situations that all involve your gameplay, and they need to be tested, as opposed to a board game that lasts for maybe 2 hours of gameplay or 15 minutes of gameplay. So the challenges for tabletop production, at the bottom, it's the opposite of digital games. The designer is not always involved. So for me, I've got worked closely with two publishers, and with my first game, Ichibanki, I was involved I was informed of changes and asked if it was okay, and I said yes. But they just did all the work with the development. Once they signed, I did not look at their print files or anything like that. And with Revenant, I've been a bit more involved, but that's also because they have wanted to evolve and modify the game, some of the design elements. And that's why I've been involved with adjusting those design elements to add certain thematic features that was not there before, and they require new features. So with a digital game, that happens all the time, every day. But in terms of the top 4 points, most board game designers are not involved with that. But they are still challenges, and we are still exposed to having to understand why they are there. So physical component restraints are a thing you, as a designer, need to be aware of, because some publishers may not take your game if you have too many huge plastic components that can't fit into a box. So normally we just adjust and make games that can fit into a box, right? But why it doesn't have to be like that. We could think, so to speak, out of the box and be creative. But that's dictated by our need to find a publisher, right? So that is why all of these things play into actually how we end up designing. And now the challenge is rule clarity and testing, and that is something that, as a designer, you try and create great rules, but as a publisher and the ones who are responsible for the product's success on the market, that is something they spend even more time on. And then, of course, one of the challenges is post-launch adjustments are impossible, and that is not something we normally think about in board games. But now that I'm comparing the two mediums, that is something you do all the time in computer games. And that is also something the designer needs to be aware of and be capable of doing, which is continuing testing and adjusting and fixing balance issues and so on. That is very difficult for tabletop productions. It does happen, retconning and so on, but it's rare. So the last thing about this production thing is I wanted to talk about is the market. And these are actually very comparable between the two mediums. So it's a very crowded market. I mean, there's like on Steam for digital games, or on the consoles, there's like hundreds of games coming out every day, right? And for board games, maybe it's not 100 games every day, but it's quite a lot of games, and a lot of we all know the shelf of shame, where you have like hundreds of games on a shelf and you've only played like 20%. So this is something we need to think about as designers. Obviously, like everything else, we mostly think about what we need to do to achieve the next step, and that is to convince the publisher. And so we focus on trying to get the publisher convinced, but it is even better to remember that the publisher is choosing your game based on the next step in it, the final step, which is how do I make the audience find this game? And they then look at your game and we think this game is something that will stand out on the market. So if you as a designer can already think about, oh, the market needs, maybe I should do this because it might be attractive to the market, or I see a hole there or something. Then you're looking beyond your initial sell to the publisher, but you're actually looking at adjusting your game towards what the publisher is actually choosing your game based on. And that is the same thing. That is exactly the same behavior that you need to adopt in my recommendation on both mediums. So digital game designers need to work this way. Tabletop designers need to work this way. And maybe for tabletop designers, it's been increasingly necessary to work this way. Maybe 15 years ago, you could just focus on the publisher and then everything was fine. So anyway, the 3 points is you need to design to stand out and basically think about what will make players look at your game, because the players, the audience, will see hundreds of new games every month. And when they go to Essen or something and they get overwhelmed with all the choices, why in the list of interesting things at Essen on the Board Game Geek will they stop when they scroll and stop and choose, think about your game and choose that? That is almost the same as when people get overwhelmed by looking at their Steam account. Why will they stop when they scroll down on the list of new Steam games? Why will they stop at your game and choose that? So that's something you need to think about. And then, of course, both situations where the gatekeeper is still the publisher. It's a bit less on digital games where it's easier to publish yourself, but very often is the tasks that the publisher perform, which is marketing and distribution and sharing with the world and making sure people find it is a skill you need then. It feels like pitch, and then of course succeed with your pitch or die, and not die of course, but then fail and not get the game out. And that's the feeling I've discovered with both board game designers and it's how does that affect how you need to design? Maybe it mostly requires courage to not end up only being scared about this and then ending up only being able to think about succeeding with this and then starting to design based on this alone. Because at the end of the day, then you won't be making good games. And that goes for both platforms. And then the last thing, which I think is kind of a new way of looking at it for board games, is that we've been looking at it with digital games for a long time. We normally think about why an audience, one of the things, parameters that make them choose a game is the price, right? If a game costs $120, which is a Kickstarter game, then it's too much, and it will kind of weed out, it will remove certain people from buying it, and you would all have a very small select group. So it's a different type of audience. So the price mattered. But I think more than anything nowadays is that the audience is starting to consider their time more than their money, at least the hardcore gamers. And that has been a relevant concern in digital games for many years. And I think it's more and more so for digital games, or for tabletop games, is that it's no longer for most Western gamers. It's not a problem to be able to afford a game they want. I mean, if they want it, they can afford it. At least for Europeans, right? We have that kind of money. But they choose not to buy it because they won't have time for it. Because there are so many other games. And of course, that plays into how do you stand out? How do you make it worthwhile to spend your time on this game? That is a very important currency to try and understand. Okay. I also cannot see a time. I don't know what time is it. How much time do I have left?
You have plenty of time left, I think. So
okay, cool.
Please go ahead.
So yeah, I have a little bit about some complexity and constraints. And my suggestion and advice here is maybe see them as creative sparks, and or creative ways to inspire you creatively. If there's something you can't use, you need to just accept it and try and find out how can you design in a way that you use it to your advantage, right? And I think that is something that is more well understood by board game designers than it is for modern day younger computer game designers. I mean, I'm old, so I started in this industry, in the digital industry, when computers were still very limited in their processing power and the amount of RAM they had. So I come from a generation where we definitely had to play within very limited barriers and come up with ways where you would still be able to sell this imaginary world to a player, even though it was just a couple of pixels on a screen. And we managed to create games where people still talk about them today, you know. And if you look at it, Ultima Online today, it looks like shit, but it just plays, it just worked, right? I think modern computer game designers have slightly forgotten that, but it reemerges every time there's a new, smaller, limited platform. Like you start playing, when mobile phones came out, suddenly you have to be limited again. I think for board game designers, the component and the physicality of the prototypes have always been understood as something you need to learn to use to your advantage. So, and limited component counts, like, oh, I want to have like 2,000 cards in my game because it's so fun if it's all the time. Yeah, but then you can't produce it at a cost-effective way, so you can only have 60 cards in your game. Okay, so how can we design a game that's still fun with 60 cards? And we even see that replicated in game jams or competitions. You have this, I think there was one time when there was this 19-card design challenge. How can you design a fun game with 19 cards, right? And I think this is very common. You know, the typical barriers and limitations for digital games could be processing power. For indie games today, it's not so much, but for the big AAAs, it's still a big issue because they are kind of pushing the limit. Digital games also have a challenge with UI, and that's on the designer, and of course the UI designer, and they work together. You might argue that with tabletop games, there's another designer than the game designer who designs the UI, and that's the person hired by the publisher. So I know designers who've never been involved with what the UI of their board game ended up looking like. I mean, it was inspired by the original prototype, but it happens differently. So that's a difference between the two. And then, of course, with digital, there's a barrier. The barrier of entry, the barrier is your ability to communicate with this rapidly moving game. And that is obviously the controls interface, which is a keyboard and a mouse. And we just take it for granted that's how it is. But, you know, there are so many different control interfaces nowadays that it doesn't have to be a keyboard. Of course, the game controller is kind of prevalent, but, you know, it might be eye tracking. I worked with a guy not so long ago who did a game where you played the game and the entire input was based on your face position in front of the screen. And you could have like multiple kids in a school class jumping up and down in front of a screen, and all of them could kind of bounce balls off the head, you know, the eye toy kind of thing. So we're not limited except in the sense that you don't have the technical capabilities to create your own interface, then of course you're limited by that. And on both sides, it's a choice of limitations as well. It's a choice of battles, right? on the tabletop side, there are stuff you need to think about. Does your game take too long to set up? Maybe that's a stupid one. It's a silly one, right? But it's something you need to think about. It's something that will be a complaint for players. It's maybe not a technical barrier. It's the component count. It's the rules complexity. And obviously all of these setup time, component count, rules complexity play into what is your target audience. And that is kind of different from the digital barriers that are much more technical. Maybe I forgot to add technical barriers on the tabletop side that are not so obvious, because most people just avoid them because they see them as too complex. But that might be that you have an interactive app. Most game designers don't think about it because they just ignore it because it's outside of their area of competence. And that actually brings me to the fourth point on the digital side, which is very important over there. But I also think it's very important on the tabletop side, but we're kind of blind to it as tabletop designers, is actually your skills, your abilities, your competences. And sometimes you and I, as a designer, will choose to avoid certain things in my design simply because I know I'm not good at it. And when I wrote it on the digital side, it was very obvious to me because I mentor and work with a lot of young teams. And if you have a team with 3 programmers and a half-decent graphic artist, they kind of adapt their process to and kind of choose to kind of go for a game design that doesn't require fully animated, realistic characters with fully articulated mouth movements and eyebrows that move and so on, because that artists and the amount of artists they have just can't do that. But I think it happens the same way for us. And maybe that is an area where we as designers should maybe explore if there's something where we can evolve ourselves. Maybe we can challenge ourselves to do things that are beyond what we are capable of doing now. I'm not saying we should do it all the time. It's totally fine to, let's say, you're not very good at writing stories. Then you choose to avoid creating narrative-driven board games. You don't have a narrative in your game. You just make math-based games. That is totally fine. I'm not saying there's something wrong with it, but it obviously becomes a limitation in your toolbox. So that's something to think about. The other thing that's here is obviously you can also go the other direction. Maybe you should go both directions, but when you make a game and you have these various barriers, just use them as inspiration. Come up with ideas to navigate around the barriers. Yeah. Okay. Lessons across mediums. I think we are all trying to craft memorable experiences, and that's the same for all. And what I'm trying to say here is maybe this is what we need to emphasize, rather than getting stuck in a specific feature or element of functionality. And when talking to game designers and development teams on both sides of both mediums, I see them fall into these pitfalls of getting stuck on trying to optimize a specific elements, like the deck building feature needs to be super perfect. And sometimes we just need to step away and figure out what is that, right? And I think the 4, maybe there are more, but these 4 are pretty good to focus on. Is first of all, know your audience and figure out how to balance accessibility and depth in a reasonable way that's suitable for your audience. And I think it's very commonplace nowadays to teach and educate computer game developers and designers, as long as they get access to senior people with advice to give, that they need to. One of the first things they hear about is, who's your audience? Who are you making the game for? And I think as board game designers, because we work more alone, and maybe we don't have a mentor to talk to, or maybe we just do it because it's fun. But at the end of the day, if we have a dream of getting the game published, maybe we forget that the game we design, eventually, we hope that it will be played by people who will eventually love our game. That's an audience. And they become an audience because the game felt good for them. Maybe it's happenstance and random that your game design just ended up with that. But I think it's something you can become more conscious about and think about, that when you choose mechanics and what kind of elements you put in your game, maybe think about if they're reasonable for the audience. The next thing is to encourage what we call emergent gameplay, and that is basically, or play, and that is stuff that wasn't written in the rules or stuff that wasn't on a card, but players talked about it as something that happened around the table, or they imagined extra stuff around the game. And of course, if you play a Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game, that happens all the time. That's the game, right? But if you play Terraforming Mars, I just played a session of Terraforming Mars, and with my son, and suddenly we were talking about the heat, the planet just heated up, but there's still no water, so it just dried out. And suddenly we were having this silly conversation about the situation on Mars, and that is, maybe that's not gameplay, but it's play, and it's something that helps create memorable experiences. And if you can have that in mind when you design, it's something that's much more obvious in a computer game, where a lot of computer games today have an element of what we call sandbox design, which is basically allowing players to exist and just goof around inside the game's world or the game area without actually initiating gameplay that has been designed as the target for the gameplay. I don't see those kind of games very often in tabletop games, but it does happen, and some games are designed to have that ability. If you talk about Dixit, that is obviously the prime example of a game that's designed to encourage emergent play and emergent experiences, where players imagine a much more than is written in the rules, right? And that's very theme-based. So yeah, of course we need to ensure fairness and clarity, and that is something board game designers are very focused on, because we understand that players need to enforce the rules. So if they don't understand them, if it's not clear, they can't play the game, and that's not fun. But this is one of the things that many computer game designers forget sometimes, because maybe we do in board games. One of the pitfalls is that we've played these type of games so much that we take for granted, because I, as a designer, know how to control a first-person shooter, that I just build a first-person shooter and just imagine everyone understands how to play it. And maybe they do, but as a designer, you can't take that for granted. And if you do, you end up sometimes just skipping or forgetting to create clarity. And another thing that's important is to allow the player to understand why these choices are relevant, or why these choices might be good and why other choices might be bad. And that is something the game needs to help communicate to the player. I call that the scaffolding that the player is gradually building in their head about the structures of the game, and how they are building it is based on what the game is giving them of information. And that is something also that board game designers are more aware of, because we know that a player needs to understand why you can buy 3 different cards, but you can only afford 1 card. Why is 1 card? Why would you choose 1 card over another? when they have different functionalities on them, and that the player needs to understand how each of these different functions can help them achieve the victory they want to achieve through certain strategies. And the game needs to communicate that. And in a computer game, it has to do that as well. And you don't have someone sitting next to you telling you, oh, I can tell you the 3 best strategies could be going this direction or that direction, as you do around a game table. So there's some work to be done there. And then, of course, reward replayability. I won't talk too much about that, but it's in computer games, you discover more of the game world every time you play. In a board game, you in some way discover all of the game the first time you play, or unless the designer has made sure that the player has a reason to, after the first game, think, oh, that was interesting. I want to try that again because I can experiment and play and discover a new memorable experience because the game has more to discover. And that's something we need to keep in mind for all designs, also on digital games. Okay.
Okay, Allan, I think maybe 5 more minutes, and then we will start the Q&A session. Does that sound good?
That's fine. I have 2 slides, or 3 maybe.
Okay.
I'll
Great.
talk less then. So very quickly, what can digital designers learn from Tabletop? Obviously, I don't know if you can learn it if you don't want to, but you can be inspired to consider social dynamics and negotiation. So that's something you can get into a digital game. That is so obvious in board games, right? Test with externals often and adjust if it's not fun. And maybe that's me as a mentor having discovered as a pitfall with a lot of younger design teams that just get absorbed with the development process of the game. And they forgot to verify if their game design is actually fun for others to play. This is something that we board game designers do a lot, because we know that we can very quickly create a prototype and get it tested. And that's something computer game designers need to be better at. And then, of course, can you have more involvement from the player in shaping and pushing the story or the gameplay? And you might argue that a board game doesn't do that either. But on the other hand, you have a lot of flexibility to play around with the board game components and agree with your co-players what you do. And maybe there's an opportunity there for digital designers. And the other way around is obvious. Maybe these are not so new, but still, for tabletop designers, you can think about dynamic pacing. And obviously timers and real-time play has been around for a long time, but and there's a lot of examples of this, but it's something you can look into. UX and feedback systems are worked on very meticulously in computer games, and sometimes designers don't think about utilizing this to help communicate their game to players. Maybe because the publisher will just solve it. I don't know, but be better at it maybe. And then interacting with the audience closer to the game's publication, and maybe allowing the audience to give feedback and adjust it. Obviously, that's something a publisher often does, but as a designer, you do it in the early stages, but you don't do it after it's gone live. I don't know how to solve this, but it might be something you can be inspired by. Okay, one last slide. Overall, both medium designers should focus on player experience first. I mean, what kind of thing do we want to give this player? Should it be scary? Should it be fun? Should it be relaxing? Should it be a family game? Should it be a mind bender? I mean, and then you choose all the other stuff. And that goes for both mediums. And then the second thing is overlaps with that. Identify the mechanics essence before actually maybe even choosing and at least implementing those mechanics. You want to have something with resource management, but there are many ways to do that. and the mechanics could be: is it card? Is it deck building? Is it tokens? How do you gather them? Can they be traded? And think about that in comparison with the experience. And then the last thing is embrace the constraints. Talked a lot about that, so I'll leave it there. I have a video, but we just tested it before. It's not going to stream. If you don't know this game, I can tell you I just saw it was Shut Up and Sit Down has done a sponsored video for this game. But I noticed it the first time because it's actually a board game done as a high quality computer game, but you play it as with your phone, and you have a hand of cards on your phone, and you don't use a controller, you don't use a mouse, you don't use a keyboard, and you play with others that are in the same room as you. It's not online. So you sit in your couch and you play cards from your phone onto the screen, but you still have some real-time components. So I think this was an interesting example to look at after having heard this talk. But I'll share the link, and you can look at it. It's a 5-minute video. You can look at it after this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allan. That was really, really interesting. And I'm already looking forward to re-watching this on YouTube later, because there was a lot of facts and a lot of good wisdom, I think. So we will now open up to any questions about this topic. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand using the meeting tool on the bottom of your screen, or write in the chat if you have any questions for Allan. Okay, I can start. It might be an easy one, but is there a point for us as board game designers to try to design a game for a digital game audience specifically? Or do you think there is
So do you want to design a tabletop board game or card game, but you want to target the audience, or do you want to transition into become a digital board game designer?
Let's say both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I was doing this PowerPoint, first of all, it was actually difficult to write because half of what I say is probably not relevant or even directly interesting if you just design board games, because you don't care about what a programmer thinks if you are never going to be designing digital games, right? So you guys listening, thank you for the patience. But I think, yeah, but the other thing I thought was it's kind of important, as I said, to understand your audience and maybe also be clear that maybe there's an opportunity somewhere to design a game for computer gamers that is not a computer game, but is designed in a way to attract and deliver what they want and need. But on the other hand, part of me also thinks, well, if you're making a computer game, make sure you give a computer gamer what they want, right? So maybe there's not that much. I mean, maybe you can you might argue that StarCraft is a real-time war game, right? And obviously there's turn-based computer games, but they are built like computer games, and they utilize, user interfaces and real-time systems that are relevant that computer gamers expect. So, so in terms of when you should transition, maybe part of that question is, maybe I can ask back, why would you transition? I mean, maybe it's easier to get a paid salary job as a computer game designer, but that's also difficult. Maybe that would be an argument. But maybe there's also a feeling that it's, I think if you don't, it takes a long time to become good at something. And there's someone that says that becoming an expert is actually not that complicated, but then you need to spend a lot of time on it. But I think that you're good at board game design. Maybe it's easier to become a good digital designer, but you also need to be good at creating a band. And that is the primary barrier, is unless you can teach yourself to be a programmer and a graphic artist and do it all yourself, a board game designer works solo most of the time, but it's impossible to create a computer game unless you can also master graphics and programming. So I would rather caution against it, really. Caution against starting to build a dream about it, because you might get disappointed when you try it and figure out making a computer game, it's more about creating a product. You need to think like a product designer and a game director more than what you are allowed to get away with as a game designer, where I know senior game designers in board games start thinking about what is the product life cycle, what is the target audience, and so on. But you can very quickly just get away with creating a fun game prototype and pitching it. And then the publisher will choose it, and because they can see the vision for the product. So that also means that if that has been your life cycle in terms of becoming a game designer, and that's the experience you've had, and you've had 6 games published as a board game designer, there's a great chance that you've never experienced, you've never actively worked on, and you've never had your brain do the complicated thinking and working and planning on shaping a product and hitting an audience. And that is something that digital computer game teams struggle a lot with. And it's what they also struggle with is actually, how can we do that while also just going all out creative and just creating a great game, when we also have to think about the colors of this shirt, or should it be a boy or a girl main character or something else, right? It's a bigger, I don't know, bigger makes it sound better. That's not what I mean. It's a more involved process. When would be a good design? When would be a good time to change? If you have a friend who's a good programmer, and if you're able to make fun user interface, I would argue, I would suggest starting to do an application that supports one of your board games. And then you will start understanding some of the complexities of also doing software. But it's a simple way to get started, and it actually then supports something you are really good at already.
Thank you. Eric has raised his hand. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Is the mic on?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just a little comment on how I treat target audiences, because I can't think like that. So I'm fully aboard with what you're saying, Allan. I simply don't seem to be able to scope what the target audience is. So what I instead do is I say that I create games for a person. So and it's very similar, I think. So because what it helps is it's one or other of those constraints that you talk about in your talk. Because if I'm making a game for my daughter, I guide some of the decisions to say, no, it needs to be simpler, for example. Well, nowadays she plays more advanced games, so it may, but the idea is still, it's you choose a target audience, but I instead choose a person, and that's what I recommend to start with, because I think that has helped me a lot and it has helped me guide some design decisions as I move forward. I made a game for my father. I made a game for my friend Benny that some of you have met, and that helps me. Okay, no, it can be way more complex. Benny can handle it. That kind of reasoning with yourself helps me, and I think that's what target audience also does for you. to some extent. I mean, I know that's not the only thing, because with the target audience, it's also the idea of, because then we can sell a lot. Okay, I skipped that part, and that's cheating out, I know, but at least it's one step towards thinking about the target audience. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach, and actually there is both in marketing and to some extent in product design, there is this term that you work with, where you define a set of personas, and the persona is basically just an invented person. And you basically give them a name, and maybe you have like Louisa and Danny. Those are our two personas, and they kind of represent a broad spectrum of what you think will be your target audience. And you kind of use some research and so on to figure that out, right? Yeah, and UX design, you do the same, yeah. So I think, but I actually think now, I'm also a teacher sometimes. The way you just did it might be easier for very young people to start with. When I say young, that's because that's the people I teach, 20 or 21 or something. And that's because even with the personas, it can become abstract, because that person just becomes like, might as well be Jar Jar Binks. And that is so unrealistic that how can I design that for? But when you design for someone you know, then you understand why a certain design feature is too complicated or too easy, or that person doesn't like trader mechanics, so I should remove it because I know that person. But maybe when you learn that, you can then start working more with the abstract target audiences from there. And I guess also sometimes it's about necessity, right? There's no reason, as far as I understand, Eric, understand your journey, there has not been a reason, you've not been forced into having to sell the game to stores or to distribution partners. That's been left to someone else. And very often, most people in this, all the people in this room are intelligent, so we are adaptable, and we can learn how to ride a motorbike if we suddenly have to, right? It's not easy, but we can learn it because it's something. We can also learn how to do marketing, but it's not what we prefer to do. We prefer to do games. So I think some of it is also fine. You don't have to learn it. You don't have to spend time. You can use your brain spending time with other things, and just, it's okay to just allow the publisher to do that. I think my answer about when do you move into digital was basically, well, then you cannot avoid having to learn that complicated new set of skills. And you might argue, well, there's also publishers there. Yeah, well, nowadays, the digital publishers are asking during a pitch, you do a pitch document and you pitch your game. It's a little bit more involved than we all know about pitching board games in Essen, for example, where you just show the prototype. Here you actually have to have a PowerPoint. And then the publisher will ask, well, what kind of traction do you already have? And I'm wondering if that is something that will start creeping in over the next 5 to 10 years for board game designers. I'm worried about it. Maybe eventually the market is so crowded that they will start asking, so how many people have already signed up to your Twitter account for your game, right? Because that's the reality for computer game design teams right now.
I can tell you that I had a pitch meeting 2 weeks ago or so. It was the first time that I got the question, who's the target audience for this game? Who are you making this game for? Who should we target with this? What kind of audience do you see for the game? And I have not heard that before, and I've been pitching since 2018 or something. So it is definitely, I've heard it once now. I guess it will start to be more and more common also for us. So I think it is probably a good tool to consider, and it could probably not be the driving force, especially not for new designers. But I mean, if you want to make a living out of this, or if you just want to, make sure that your game sells, yes, I think we are already there in the board game market too, that we should, as designers, think about it at least and make sure that we have an audience if we want to pitch it.
And yes, and maybe it's also, I mean, this is not at all the topic of this talk. This is more about how you talk to in business meetings and so on. But now we're talking about the skills that we have as designers, and we're an individual, so we can easily identify it's a personal skill. But if you look at the publishers or the collaborators or the distributors or the people we try and pitch to, let's say in Essen at Spiel, they are a company. Usually one person represents that company receiving our pitch. But the way that they have structured their business means that they have skills in-house that are either capable of reading a designer and accepting a designer's pitch as here is my game design, and I will leave it up to you to understand my game design and take it from there. Whereas others have less of a skill set or are less interested in the creative part. They just want to get a product. And I guess it's something that we if we know a publisher, if we know a business contact that we've met them before, we will know beforehand what kind of information they will want from us. But it's something you need to be prepared for, that you might go into a meeting and you've never met the person before, and this person is just more like a distributor turned publisher. So they start talking about what kind of shop do you plan to this game to be in, or whatever they talk about, right? So yeah, I think that personally I prefer to work with publishers that really also understand the designer's approach. Then I can just talk design, and they can also understand the business side.
Okay. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay. Astro Lasse, I think you were first. I'm not really sure.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hope that's a real name. That's really
it's
cool.
not. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I kind of forgot that I had my account name active here. But
Oh, that's cool.
I tried to change it, but I didn't want to do it. So I don't know if this is kind of like a weird question, but since this is a sort of like a game design group, how do you choose which sort of gameplay mechanics to use in games? I mean, there are so many, or rather, I mean, there are, especially when it comes to tabletop games, there are these sort of oldies and goodies, like, like deck building or dice games or whatever. How do you choose which ones to use when you design games? Since, especially in tabletop games, I feel that it can be more difficult to be sort of innovative when it comes to gameplay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm just throwing this question out there because I mean, like most other people here, I assume, I mean, you have these sort of game ideas floating around. You have, it's almost like a book, you know what kind of story you want to tell, but you don't know exactly how to tell it.
I think how do you choose? I think it's, for me, when I started designing, so you go through stages, or at least I did, but I've talked to others, and you kind of, the first stage is, I think this is cool, I want to try something like that. And that is very often associated with a mechanic. You've played some game with deck building and you want to try and do a deck building game. You played some game with dice rolling and you want to try and do something like that. But then over time, when you start doing more, you start opening up to wanting to try different mechanics, not necessarily because that was what inspired you, but because you learn about them, right? And to me, I compare it a little bit with the ingredients in food. And the comparison goes beyond just, there are different ingredients. I also think it's a relevant comparison because you need to become good at using using an ingredient in food the right way. You need to understand that, I can put carrots in whatever, right? I can put carrots, but then I can chop them. I can chop them on the long end, on the short end. I can grind them. I can do all kinds of things, and they behave differently depending on how early I put them into the pot of boiling water, how late, or maybe they will be a little bit more crunchy, and maybe this is where the comparison starts falling apart. But basically, you become a better chef, and you can become an innovative chef, not by combining ingredients that people have never seen before. Well, that is obviously innovative. But most chefs combine ingredients in their own way with ratios and understanding of those ingredients that are just nuances different from the other combinations. And then they combine it with a theme that's a little bit different from the other themes that we've seen before. And then it becomes your personal thing. It's like a writer that writes a book and the ingredients are the words and the sentences and the way they are phrased. We've seen that hundreds of times, words on paper. That's not innovative. We've seen I sentences or first person writing of a book before. So if you start thinking that you can't do a first person point of view in when you write a book because that's not innovative, then you kind of can't write any books. So you need to come, at least that's what I found out, I need to come to terms with the fact that I need to make my there's a course called beef stroganoff, right, which is mashed potatoes and a beef stew or something like that. That tastes different depending on which chef made it. And sometimes it's just okay to make a beef stroganoff and then try and deviate it with a little bit of more curry or whatever, right? And I think that's what we need to remember as designers is there is obviously out there a hunt, the cult of the new, not just the cult of the good, but the cult of the new. And you can sometimes feel like that's what everyone's talking about. And that it's random whenever you invent something that's actually new. And if I've done that, I woke up one morning, I've never tried that before, that's it. But when I design something like a chef, it becomes more like I'm focused on quality and the game that is its own thing, maybe slightly recognizable. I guess so. How do you then choose the ingredients? Partly by just deciding what is right for. So if you go back to the slide I had where I argued that you should try and think about what do you want players to feel? What should the experience? Start with that. And I want to make a game where people can combine all kinds of things, and they feel like they can build something. Okay, so I need a lot of small components they can combine. What kind of mechanics or systems could work with that? Maybe cards, or maybe it could be a lot of different tokens. And then the question is, which one of these is then the right type of flavor for the game you're doing? And how do you then make the first choice for your prototype? That, unfortunately, is a trial and error effort. There's no real simple way to make the right choice the first time, at least for me. And I try sometimes. I rack my brain to come up with mathematics that try and figure out why is this better than that. And sometimes it's just, even though my calculation showed when I play, it doesn't feel right. And that's what a chef does. You taste the food all the time. If it still doesn't taste right, you put something out. Worst case, you need to throw all of it out and start over. And I think that's how the process of how I choose. Then how do you make the first choice? Sometimes it's just based on, I like cards better than tokens. And maybe when you see, there are designers out there on Board Game Geek that are famous, and you have gamers that are not game designers, but they talk about these designers. Oh, and that's obviously a Uwe Rosenberg game, right? And that's probably because Uwe is a chef that has a tendency to favor certain mechanics. His games are different, but they have the same kind of flavor. And that's the same with chefs, right? You have like famous chefs, they have a style. And maybe that's okay. Maybe you don't need to be innovative. Maybe you just need to have a style. So if you favor deck building and you have an idea of building a game that has a feel of that, where that works, just use that. That would be my very long answer.
Yeah,
Okay.
I hope you got your answer. And I think we need to move on. So, Tom Cruise. Go ahead.
Hi there, am I audible?
Yep.
Happy to say that is my real name, so no ambiguity there. But Allan, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing with us. My question is like that, but with a bit of different spice. So I'm an instructional designer in my daily practice. I create learning materials, training materials for professionals to grow skills. But I'm very interested generally in the idea of games for education. Whether that be skills development, whether that be learning about history. In your experience, have you come across a tabletop game, something in the analog play space, that you think is a good example of that, an educational game or something that teaches you while you happen to be having fun?
Yes, but there is commercial games. Like entertainment games you buy in shops. Well, the other type of game is also commercial, but that's a kind of work for hire that you develop for a specific customer, and that is very often how educational games are made, or maybe they're created and that are shared among certain schools. And sometimes that's fine, but sometimes that also is because the game is not entertaining enough for anyone to want to buy it in the shop. So maybe that's why you have the question. I think there are. It depends on what's the educational goal. So one of the challenges, maybe my example here is actually from digital. I worked with a team once that were trying to develop. You could create small theater plays. So you could take some actors and put them on there, and you could take like speech bubbles, and write text, and they would talk to each other. And that was for the Danish language education and teaching students how to write small conversations and stories, right? So teaching young students. And it was kind of fun because you could then put it on the timeline and have these characters go like, and talk to each other. And then they can play it for their classmates. And was that a game? I don't know, but they could have fun with it. It was more like a sandbox. Anyway, the barrier there, and even more so if it's like the hard tech skills and so on, like what's it called, mathematics and physics and so on. Teachers cannot use it if it's not accurate enough according to their requirements or teaching requirements or stuff like that. And then if you work with a company where you need to teach stuff, there's the same things. And I guess this is one of the reasons why educational games are not always fun. That's because they have requirements that they need to deliver a certain educational value that is evaluated by what it's equivalent of a textbook, right? So you cannot prioritize fun in such a game. Fun is always secondary to the knowledge that need to be transferred. But if I should point to a game that's published as an entertainment game, I think it's mobile. One example is Mobile Markets. It's a mobile, and the reason is, what does that teach? Because it doesn't have a declared purpose of teaching anything. So you have to kind of look at it and play it, and then think about, hey, that's actually a good equivalent of what an actual market fluctuations look like in real life. So then I would need to play it. I would need to be able to interpret that before I would be able to understand that I could use it in my education of teaching business class students of how market works. So that was your question. Do you have an example? Maybe others have
That's
other
exactly what I was looking
examples.
for. I think I saw a couple of people in chat, but in the meantime, thank you so much for addressing it personally.
Okay, we move on to Daniel, who also raised his hand.
Yes, I did. I hope I can be heard at this point. I'm using a Bluetooth headset.
Yeah.
I don't know how reliable it is. First off, hello, Allan. Nice to see you again, and thank you for giving this amazing talk. And I'm happy to hear that you struggled a bit in making your presentation. That brings me great joy. It's good to know that we're not only being challenged as listeners, but also as presenters. Onto my question, you mentioned earlier a little bit about Balatro and the success of video games that have incorporated tabletop mechanics to some extent. And this is something I've been thinking about for a few years with the success of, Slay the Spire, or even Hearthstone incorporating CCG mechanics and that sort of thinking. So my question is basically, my perception is that there's an increased interest in tabletop mechanics in video games, but you touched upon it briefly, I think, and I interpreted it as such that there isn't really a demand for tabletop designers in the video game space. Could you talk a bit on that topic? Is there a demand overall, or what's your take on it?
Yeah, so I work at a place where there is an interest in kind of following what are the demands of the market in terms of job options and so on, because it's an educational institution, right? And what I've noticed over these many years is that very difficult to understand what there's actually demand for, because at least in Denmark, it's very often driven, the insight is more often driven by the people who shout the loudest about being frustrated about it. And then it turns out that once they found their perfect employee, it's like, no one is educating game programmers anymore. No one is educating, we need more game programming. Then they do lobbyism towards politicians and all that stuff. And then it turns out that was just that one company that was powerful enough to be able to shout and talk to the media and so on. So is there a general demand? And when you say there's a general demand, I don't think it works like that. I don't think there's like a wave of suddenly everyone wants this. It's different. It's dangerous to see it like that. But what was your question actually? I forgot it. I started talking. I forgot it.
No, it's basically with the success of video games that incorporate tabletop mechanics, do you think that there has been an increased demand for designers that are well versed in tabletop mechanics?
No. I think because what then would imply that digital game companies would choose to hire someone like that over someone who's well versed in digital game development. And in my experience, they always prioritize experience with digital game development, because a digital game development designer with a couple of digital games behind them, well, they would normally think that that person can adapt their design skills they would normally think that it's more difficult to get a pure digital designer who understands printing stuff and having cardboard prototypes to actually understand how to use the Unity game engine editor. So they see that as the barrier, the job market. So then you could ask, where would the demand otherwise come from, if not in terms of employment? It might come from publishers being interested in those kind of products. And I think there will always be hype bubbles of the latest, most popular. Suddenly there was like not suddenly, but some time ago, the Mind came out. And, we've all seen like variations of games with 150 cards or 100 cards that are all numbered in a certain way, and now you play them like that, right? It's the Mind copies, right? Or, ganz schön clever copies. So is there, and I think I've seen a lot of Mass Fleur also had a design that was kind of a Bellatro or poker-like inspired, trying to jump on that bandwagon. I think that's an opportunity. That's like, there was fidget spinners. Remember those? Like you had one of these and you could spin it, right? I don't see them anywhere anymore. But at one point, a lot of people made a lot of money on being quickly reacting to that, right? It's like Bitcoin and so on. That was really big at one point. Everyone tried it, and now it's like down to the level. And I think it's the same thing. So if you want to jump on those opportunities, you need to be a kind of designer that designs that way. And that can work. So you need to be able, if it's hot right now, if you think it's hot in Essen, you need to be able to create a design and deliver in a pitch it in Essen, because next year it's gone. That hype bubble doesn't mean that tabletop overlap is gone, or computer game inspired mechanisms in tabletop games is not relevant. But then at that point, it's kind of down to the level where at the end of the day, if the game is good, then it will work. And then, yeah, it has some of those mechanisms. But yeah, in terms of you getting a job in the computer games industry, I think it's more important that you start spending time doing prototypes inside a computer game development environment and learning the technical aspects of that, because that's what you need to be able to do. You're not, as a computer game designer, you're not making rules. You're working in the game engine and implementing the game. Unless maybe there are some really big companies where you can just sit and think theoretic game design, but that rarely happens.
Okay. Do we have any final questions for Allan? I see that we are running long tonight. Usually we have a short break and then do an open discussion afterwards, but I think this format worked as well, with a longer presentation and a longer Q&A, because you have a lot of knowledge to share, and I think we all got much wiser from this talk. And thank you very much, Allan, for the talk and the answers to all of our questions.
Cool. I think people can find me online somewhere. Most of you guys that have video on know me anyway, so
that's great.
And,
yeah.
I wanted to share the video. Maybe I can just do it, that Sonderfolk game, so that people can just watch that and see what it's all about. It's not like a fancy thing. It's just a fun thing I found that looked like a board game on the computer. Can I share it in the Facebook group, maybe? Is that better?
Yeah, I think you can leave a link in the chat here in the meeting, and I will post the link in the comment section of the YouTube.
Okay, I was just wondering if the chat disappeared once the thing was over.
Yeah, it will, but I can find it afterwards. So
okay,
that won't be a problem.
Okay. Let me just get the link here. It's loading. It's
Mhm. There we go. And I actually came to think of another question that I had written down. You mentioned that players nowadays are thinking about games as being worthy of their time, and it just occurred to me that when we pick a game to play as a tabletop game, we look at the playtime and consider is this enough for is this a good enough playtime for this event this evening or this dinner party or whatever. But when you look at a digital game, you often see gameplay hours instead, and
yeah.
kind
I
of
think
on
you
the different end of the spectrum there. So
yeah.
I was I don't really know if I had a question about it, but I think time is well, if it should be worthy of a player's time, it should also be a really good game throughout the entire gameplay. I
I
guess.
think that's correct, but I also think you also put I don't know if it was an answer, if it's not a question, but you almost put it into the thing you phrased yourself, is that the reason why it works like that with board games is that you're not alone. So when you're alone, you don't have to agree on what to do with others. So you just start doing it. If you feel like it, you start doing it, right?
That's a really good point. Yeah.
And with board games, the negotiation starts even before the board game is on the table. And we all know the most frustrating thing about a board game night, if you end up spending 30 minutes discussing which game to play because we can't agree, right? And then you can just be frustrated, but you can also look at it as, I see that as maybe the most important thing is not the game, which is a little bit sad because I want my game to be important. It's almost like the most important thing is what we agree on and that we do it together. And so it comes back to some of my points in the slide, right? That
it's a social activity in another way, and there's a magic circle thing happening as well.
And of course, different play groups prioritize this differently, right? There are some play groups where all of the players are so keen on enjoying the game experience that we can just go. And people that enjoy these games where there's almost like 4 parallel solo games where you just have your own strategy, and they still enjoy being together. And it's I don't know what that we can use that information for, but it is that is probably also why it's difficult to. There are less games with such high play times, where in computer games you can have a game where you're basically demanding that for a player to get the maximum value out of the game, they need to spend at least 20 to 50 hours. That's just a personal choice, but for me to coordinate and agree on meeting regularly so we end up with 50 hours of combined gameplay, or just agreeing on when I play Gloomhaven with my friends. That's complicated. So it's one of the barriers to getting to board games. So I work with Mind Clash Games for my game, and they have a huge audience of solo players. And I think that audience will be bigger over the next 10, 20 years. We have more people living alone. We have more divorces. We have more people not choosing to live in relationships or just living alone. And then they go out and have social interaction when they want to, but they also enjoy their own time. It's not necessarily miserable people, but that means they may just choose to enjoy board games solo. which there's always been solo games, but I think the extent to which we see people play very complicated solo games is a little bit surprising to me, but maybe it's like how we evolve as a society.
Okay, thank you very much. That's even more wisdom for us all. Yes, I think we need to conclude tonight's session. I think we have been going on for almost 2 hours, but it goes to show that this was a really interesting topic and a lot to be said.
At least it shows that I talk a lot.
Yeah, that too, but it's interesting, so we really don't mind. So that's great.
Okay.
Thank you very much again, Allan, and thank you everyone who joined us.
Bye.
Bye.